Hello, freaks, and welcome to Radical Research, where we definitely sweat the small stuff. Thanks as ever to everyone who listens, responds, contributes their thoughts regarding our topics and episodes. We really appreciate it. Hunter and I also appreciate donations. This helps us with hosting and other related costs. We get no monetary reward from doing this thing, and while we aren't out to make a single cent, your contributions allow us to expand and grow in ways that we hope to see the fruits of sometime in the future. The PayPal ID for donations is
radicalresearchpodcast@gmail.com.
Hunter.
Yes.
Did you hear, I think the news went around earlier this week at the time of recording, that Johan Landquist was back in Candlemass?
I did hear that, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, the singer from Epicus, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great news. I mean, here's the thing. For those who don't know, I'm just going to name him as if you've never heard of him before. But I hope that Leif Endling, the bassist and leader and songwriter of Candlemass, can come up with like the goods musically, because I felt that those last two EPs with Mats Levin were just kind of skirting substandard.
Right. Which is kind of a disappointing thing, considering that you really want to hear like Mats Levin in a really good Candlemass album, right?
We'll get into him because he figures into this episode subject tonight, and I've always liked him, but he's one of those guys that's not on a lot of stuff that we love.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, and he's a great vocalist, and he finally got into Candlemass, and I've been wishing for that for years. And then you get kind of two substandard EPs, but I think Leif Endling, man, I don't think we could hail him enough.
He's pretty much unimpeachable. Yeah.
We'll be doing a lot of that on this episode, no doubt. But I felt that there was a little bit of writing malaise coming into some of the later Robert Lowe material. A lot of that's really good too, though. So anyway, let's go back to a time, the mid-90s, when he was in full songwriting mode and really kind of like expanding out from the kind of epic doom metal that he had pretty much founded, or at least perfected in Candlemass.
I almost feel like he really did kind of codify that sound. You know, I mean, obviously he had his influences, but I feel like the entire epic doom sound is the result of Leif Endling.
He was influenced by Sabbath, of course, and then, other stuff like Angel Witch and Deep Purple, and the list goes on and on and on. Budgie, I think, figured in there for him.
Sure.
But, it's funny. Yeah, think about it. Like Black Sabbath were just Black Sabbath. I don't think you could say, like St. Vitus was very street, and Trouble was very kind of this sculpted, biblical kind of, a little more angular than Candlemass. Candlemass had this just flowing, like medieval.
Yeah, like majestic.
Yeah, and he really did found it, because I don't think you can find many great sewed-up examples of exactly what Epicus was in 1984, 85.
So. Man, what a debut. Arriving in fully materialized form.
Right, and I think most people listening to this podcast in general probably know the basic history of Candlemass, so we're not going to give it tonight. But I did want to swing back to the 90s and this band called Abstrakt Algebra. By that time, Leif Endling had knocked Candlemass on the head for the first time since it had formed. They put out this Chapter 6 album, which technically it was their fifth. And that was cool. It moved them into like a more sort of power metal-y direction. How familiar are you with that one? I don't know if we've talked about Chapter 6 that much.
Familiar in passing. I actually don't even own it.
Yeah, it's good.
But I checked it out.
It's good. It has production issues. I think it's cold, kind of clanky. But the material is really cool, kind of a little more heavy metal in the way that Solitude Aeturnus was always very heavy metal.
Right.
A band definitely influenced by Candlemass. But anyway, that album kind of got a tepid response, and then they kind of disappeared, and Leif Endling reappeared with this band called Abstrakt Algebra, Abstract with a K, featured, as we mentioned, Mats Levin on vocals, also featured Mike Weed on guitar. I know, Hunter, you're a huge Memento Mori fan amongst his other credits.
Love Mike Weed.
Abstrakt Algebra also featured this guy named Carl Westholm on keyboards. He would kind of become the Jeff Nichols of Candlemass. Like, he played, the guy that would play with on different Sabbath eras and Sabbath albums. This guy, Westholm, played on various Candlemass era albums, including the two we're going to talk about here. and a guy named Heiho Perkovic on drums, who would also feature into some of the stuff we're going to talk about later on. So that was Abstrakt Algebra. Did you pick up on Abstrakt Algebra when they came out with their one and only album in the mid-90s?
No, I got it much later.
Yeah.
Like early 2000s.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was a weird thing. In 1995, it was kind of the album that nobody wanted, just in terms of what was going on.
It definitely was like, that was not my headspace in 1995.
Because it tried, in terms of imagery and some elements, it tried to fit into the sort of progressive metal thing happening, that post-Dream Theater thing. But I think that was really more cosmetic. And I know that Leif Endling was a fan of Dream Theater's Images and Words and Awake at that time.
Right.
And I remember talking to him. I was actually sharing a booth with him and Borovoy in LA. Go figure. And Abstrakt Algebra had just kind of started doing its thing. And he was talking about Dream Theater, like this is going to be an album that like will show my Dream Theater influence. And I'm like, it came out and I was like, not really. It's more It's more in the realm of like Eternal Idol or Tear by Black Sabbath, although not that good. You know, that kind of, can you hear that at all?
Yeah. Like, dark, epic metal. Yeah.
And
I get the aspirations, but it doesn't really come across the Dream Theater influence, at least.
No, I agree with you. It tries. I hear more Evergrey in it, the band that from Sweden that would become kind of a bigger prog metal thing.
You know what I wonder, and I haven't really until now, is I wonder how aware of Lion's Share Leif Endling was, because Lion's Share is basically like Dream Theater meets Eternal Idol.
Yeah.
And it actually hits the mark, and they're Swedish.
Totally agree. Yeah, no, that's a really good observation. I'll have to go back and listen. You turned me on to Lion's Share. Of course, I'd known about them through the years, and with my love of things like, I know they're not Swedish, but like TNT, Silver Mountain, a lot of the more, the early Europe stuff. It's like, how did I not know Lion's Share? But thank you. And that's a really good point, that there's a lot of that in Abstrakt Algebra for sure. So this came out. It was novel to hear Endling doing this kind of stuff. Cool to hear Mats Levin on something cool. I never really totally loved this album. Where do you land with it then and now?
Yeah, I don't know that it's completely lovable. I'll always keep it. I think it is a kind of a mid-90s curiosity, and I do think it's good, and I think it's got merit. But like, I wonder too how much of that I'm reading into these Candlemass records that we're going to talk about tonight, which I love very passionately.
Yeah,
because there's a direct genetic link.
Well, exactly. I was just going to say that this album gets more praise than I think it should, and the albums we're going to talk about by Candlemass get less. And I feel like this is the weaker link between like Chapter 6 and the albums we're going to talk about. But it definitely figures highly. It's very important. And if you're a fan of any strain of Swedish metal, then you have to understand it at least. So we're going to kind of preface our talk about these late 90s Candlemass albums by listening to a little bit of this Abstrakt Algebra album we've been talking about. We're going to play a song called Shadowplay. This came out in 1995. It was the self-titled and only Abstrakt album on the Swedish label Mega Rock.
Dance
So even if we're both sort of not 100% into that album, I think we like it enough to get into something like that, because that's a really great moment on that record.
I was about to say, if the entire album were that good, then I would be all about the record.
Yeah. And it's never bad. Like there's no huge misstep. It's just, it doesn't quite nail what it's trying to nail all the time, especially with the talent in it. Mike Weed, Matt Slavin, of course, Leif Endling, running things. And then, that lineup, for the most part, went on to record Abstrakt Algebra 2. That was supposed to be the name of the second album. It went poorly. In terms of the sound quality and the vibe that they were getting down, Leif Endling just didn't feel confident that he had anything worth any label's interest. And he started to lose hope. And he talks about, in interviews from this era, he talks about like really having lost his mind. I don't know how serious that is, but he sounds like he had some level of breakdown. This creation of his was wandering, and he'd never experienced that since probably the last days of Nemesis or something, the pre-Candlemass band. But Music for Nations, the label, of course, everybody should know what that is and who that is. They entered the picture. They were interested. They had put out Chapter 6 by Candlemass, and they listened to the stuff and they said, look, this is pretty good. We would really prefer you call this band Candlemass, and then we'll put it out. And then Leif scrapped everything, rebuilt Abstrakt Algebra 2 into another album that we'll talk about in just a second. I did want to play something from that aborted session, a song called Blue Wizard, which appeared on the next Candlemass album as a song called Whiz.
I really like this version.
I really do too. And let's just take a listen, and we'll talk about when we get back. There you go, a little material from the aborted second album sessions by Abstrakt Algebra, obviously showing a more doom-heavy direction there, right?
Yes.
And the whole thing, though.
And an earthier direction, too.
Yeah, definitely. So, even though people talk about, Dactylis Glomerata by Candlemass is nothing but a Abstrakt Algebra album, I mean, it's more Candlemassy than the first Abstrakt album for sure.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Worth noting, just for continuity's sake, the guitarist on the second Abstrakt Algebra album, Never to Be, was a guy named Patrick Instead. He replaced Mike Weed. So Mike Weed, as he does sometimes, he kind of came and went really quickly.
I don't think that Mike Weed would have been an appropriate guitarist for this material, really.
And what's funny about that?
I'm sure he would have done a serviceable job, but like Mike Weed's talents are better deployed elsewhere.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that, because the guy that Leif Endling would go ahead and get for this next Abstrakt album turned Candlemass album, Dactylis Glomerata, was Mike Amat, of all people.
Right.
Who I think is very much in the style of a Mike Weed or a Frederick Akesson or that kind of guy, right?
Yeah, but his background is like completely different than either of those guys.
This is very,
because he's always been a Doom fan. He was into, Swedish hardcore, obviously came up through Carnage, got into Carcass. So like Mike Amat is an interesting character because he kind of like wraps all of those things into one. But yeah, he definitely has the capacity to be an Akasin or a Weed. But I feel like he's got affinities too that lend him well to this new Candlemass.
But Mike Amat is not hugely present on Dactylis the way you might think of Mike Amat on any given Amat record, right?
Well, I mean, if you didn't know, by way of the liner notes that Mike Amat was involved, I'm not entirely sure you would know it's Mike Amat.
Well, fair enough. I think the point's made. We won't have to make it later. But one other thing I want to say about
Leif Endling, directs the music in such a way that it kind of. I'm not going to send it because the guitar work's anything but anonymous, but like it could have been anybody else too.
I agree with that. It's the least Amatish Amat record, basically.
Yes.
One thing I want to say about the transition at this point for Leif Endling really was that it reminds me of like Black Sabbath's Seventh Star or Manila Road Circus Maximus, where both times those records were being recorded as either a solo project or something that was to be called something different. And then the record label comes in and says, hey, that's cool stuff, but we want it's not cool enough.
Want the name.
It's not cool enough that we think we can sell it with that name. So can you go back to the old name?
Right. I think Seventh Star is cool enough. I'm a big fan.
You're a bigger fan than I am.
I love my Glenn Hughes, man.
To me, that album is just like bookended by monolithic albums that it can't possibly compete with.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Born Again and Eternal Idol. That's a whole other conversation, I suppose.
Okay, yeah.
I don't mean to belittle your Seventh Star. But.
So after Abstrakt Algebra, the Candlemass name hadn't really been whispered in some time. And out of, at least to me, maybe not to you, to other people, but to me, I remember being completely blown away by the fact that Candlemass had reappeared. They were on Music for Nations. They had this album called Dactylis Glomerata, and it had this like completely new lineup. I think very, very significantly, a new vocalist named Bjorn Flodqvist, who added an entirely different dimension to the Candlemass fray. I mean, Candlemass we sort of associate with this, epic, majestic, dramatic, overwrought kind of vocal style.
A lot of warbling, a lot of vibrato.
Musical, yeah, obviously like Messiah. Messiah is the king of vibrato and metal. And Bjorn brings almost like sort of an outsider sort of approach to it.
Yeah, good call.
Like, I mean, he sits very comfortably in a metal context, but I feel like he could have been put in like an alternative rock band and done just as well, right?
Yeah, and he actually was in a band later called Enter the Hunt that was kind of like that. It had that sort of post-alternative or post-grunge sort of vibe. But it was darker and maybe possibly a little doomier. But he worked well in that context for sure.
So you reviewed this album for Maniacs, correct?
Yeah, I believe I did.
So that was actually how I came to know about Dactylis Glomerata. In fact, I remember exactly where I was on Peachtree Road in Atlanta in the summer of '98 when I read that review.
I remember.
And people, if you don't know, like I used to take, before I actually got to know Jeff Wagner, like this guy was like my idol. And I remember like with distinct memory every word that the guy wrote before I actually got to know him.
Well, that's hilarious and awesome to me, but like if I'm honored to know you.
It was a fine review too, as I remember.
I remember where I was at when I got it and heard it. I was walking back from the subway in Astoria, New York from my Maniacs job and looking at it. And I had one of those like CD Walkman players at the time. And looking at the CD as I was kind of walking home on the sidewalk and going, wow, this looks different and sounds different. And again, the information just wasn't there. So you were like kind of suddenly getting this Candlemass album and suddenly hearing that they're changing direction. And but I was into it from the beginning. It just not just because of the Candlemass name, but or that skull and
it's tapered wood of some sort.
It's a completely badass logo, especially for a skull, which can often be kind of trite. But I remember looking at that and the album cover and the titles and listening to
the titles like really got me.
Oh, sure. And just like kind of being sucked into it. And I've been sucked into it ever since. This album and the next one, From the 13th Sun, subject of the episode, obviously, really pivotal albums for me, like in terms of when they came out, what they still mean to me, and where they sit with a band that I really, really care about and have since the first album. A band that I don't think has made a lot of missteps, but the highlights are high. And I think these two albums are very high on our list. Most other Candlemass fans don't agree. I get the sense, and that's why we're kind of talking about them tonight. So what do you say we go into Dustflow right away and just talk about it?
Please.
All right.
Someone could tell who you are, but the seasons fled and the blackbird stared in these clouded days. All my doubts will stay right by my side. In flood and tide, just close my eyes. My love's tonight. Right by my side. In flood and tide, just close my eyes.
High point of the album?
High point in the discography.
Wow. Okay. So you do think it's the best one on this album?
I'm not entirely sure about that, but I mean, man, so many moments actually.
The keyboards, when they just come in, that lifts it up a new level. Kind of brings it back to that older Gothic Candlemass.
But Gothic, but I got like Rainbow kind of vibes from it too.
Ooh, yeah,
Like
sure. Sure.
Yeah, but like the vocals and the atmospherics at the beginning of that, I almost could, in a weird way, hear like a No Man Tim Bonus kind of thing going on there.
Love it. Yeah, I totally hear that.
You know, you're being introduced to an entirely new iteration in the Candlemass sound. You know, this is a guy chasing a new vision altogether.
Well, when I told you about walking, home in Astoria and listening to this and being really blown away by it, I think this was the song, because this comes up fairly early in the album.
Right. What's that number? Is third song on the album?
Yeah, and it's like, it starts with Whiz. It has I Still See the Black. Like those are kind of upbeat, rocking, very Candlemass, like, but very Chapter 6 Candlemass too, where they're a little faster, a little more energy and kind of power and precision. Not that the other Candlemass didn't have that, but I think you know what I mean, the power metal thing.
Sure,
and then Dustflow comes in, and wow, like suddenly we're almost in, like you said, No Man, Tim Bonus world, Pink Floyd world, Uriah Heep world, Rainbow world. Yeah, that's
the Heap. Yeah, no, you're dead on with the Heap thing.
Well, Leif Endling loved them, so there you go. That we're hearing it. But yeah, anyway, do you know what Dactylis Glomerata is?
I don't actually.
I haven't known it
since
that
up before we did this.
That day in a story, but now I know. About a week ago, I looked it up. It's orchard grass. Just a common species of grass, and apparently Leif Endling is allergic to it. Isn't that awesome? I also want to call out Mons Monson, who plays theremin on Dustflow. Now, if we add theremin to Dustflow, that suddenly does become our favorite song on this album, right?
I guess so, yeah.
By default.
Yep. Synth whores.
Synth whores, yeah. We should do a
pretty easy lay when it comes to a synth, man. I feel like you and I are like likely to forgive a bad song if it had like a badass Moog squelch or something.
Ladies and gentlemen, Hunter and I are starting a spin-off podcast called Synth Whores, coming to you in November of 2018. Check it out. You're right, though. I have some sort of questionable 70s prog albums that I love because of the synth. I'm just keeping that because, like the what's this? What was the German band? Is it Epidaurus or something like that?
Oh yeah, Epidaurus, yeah.
Like I like it fine. I have some problems with it, but like that is a synth masterpiece.
I have that album.
Just
Yeah.
in terms of the sounds, like
Totally.
I'm keeping that. And even though it's kind of dodgy in spots, like I'm keeping that.
No, it's a gorgeous synth record.
Episode 1 of Synth Whores, Epidaurus.
Epidaurus.
And every subtitle of those will be Synths are great.
Synths are the best, man.
Speaking of synths, they're keyboards of various kinds were Carl Westholm's stock and trade. They're all over Dactylis Glomerata. One song we're not going to play for you is Abstrakt Sun. I think that's truly one of the best from this whole era. We just didn't pick it. We're going to listen in succession to Apathy and then Lidocaine God. They kind of come together on the album. We're going to listen to snippets of both, and we'll come back and revel in their awesomeness.
Watching 7 holy men ringing on the funeral bell, flashing it so all can see. They sink it in a pond, torching open corridors.
So there were several Candlemass B-sides from this era that kind of took Lidocaine God, the last snippet we heard, and sort of split it in two, and they focused on like either the really kind of like swingy, kind of loungy, sort of rhythmic vibe
right
to that song, and then like or they would split and just like the song called Rock and Roll, of all song titles, just would delve into the really fast part, and that they were these B-sides. So this era of Candlemass, even though it's only 2 albums, it does have some interesting sort of B-sides and extra stuff that you should really seek out on discogs.com.
Agreed.
And one day we're going to have a Discog sponsorship. That's my goal here.
That would be pretty sweet.
It's the only reason we do this.
We're building up to that. 3 records.
What do you want to say about those?
God, what I want to say is I should listen to these albums more often than I do even. like just hearing these snippets, like they kind of scratch like almost every conceivable itch that I have as a music listener.
I can see what you mean. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's heavy, it's dark, it's super textured, it's atmospheric, it's catchy. I don't know. I'm really proud of the fact that we were spending a couple of hours of our life defending the worth of these albums.
You know what's funny is like the life of this podcast so far, there have been shows, and certainly the next episode are things that we knew immediately were going to happen like within the first 10 episodes. That didn't always happen, of course, but I'm just saying there were things that were just obvious and imminent.
Conclusions,
yeah, they were foregone conclusions. They were imminent. And this one was kind of like a whim. Like it just occurred to me, like, let's do this. Let's talk about these. I don't think enough people do.
And I can understand like why these albums might not appeal to your, and I don't mean to cast aspersions here, but I mean, I guess there are Candlemass fans for whom like Nightfall and that sound is kind of the be all end all. And I understand why that Dactylis or From the 13th Sun would not appeal to that listener.
Yeah.
But they are crucial cogs in the Candlemass discography and part of an overarching vision. And the thing is, it's the vision of the same man that authored, the debut and authored Nightfall. And anyway.
That's a really, really excellent point, because this was steered by one guy, a guy that was primarily influenced by Black Sabbath. And any true Black Sabbath fan, and I will cast an aspersion here, but any true Black Sabbath fan goes beyond the first 4 albums. Like those are amazing. A couple of them are flawed, and we can debate that some other time, but like those are amazing. But the stuff they did after that was just as amazing. I mean, there's no question in my mind. And what I feel that Leif Endling does with Candlemass is kind of the same model. Like he wasn't afraid to take it into new areas. I mean, even Chapter 6 was a very different move for them. And I think by Tales of Creation, I love that album, but I'm glad that he realized they were kind of hitting a wall and didn't need to keep going there.
Yeah, no, he was lateral at that point.
Yeah, and Tales of Creation was totally one of my favorite lateral albums ever. The other lateral album in their career was Ancient Dreams, which I'm not as big of a fan of as Nightfall and Tales of Creation.
Neither am I.
Though I love it, But anyway, that's Dactylis Glomerata. The other thing I want to say before we get to the second and final album of this era is that Leif Endling had a way of picking vocalists, man. And I think we've touched on this before, but if we list them,
yeah, for sure.
Think about, the guy in the first album who we've mentioned is back in the band. That guy was incredible. That guy was still probably my favorite singer in this band. And the guy that we're listening
He's
to,
like the Scott Rieger of Candlemass.
Good comparison, man. That's great. Scott Rieger's is a favorite of mine, and I think they've got a similar sort of ghostliness to them.
Yeah, for sure, like a desperation.
Yeah. But you look at him, you look at Messiah. Messiah was totally great for what he was doing. Absolutely. I mean, I give that guy huge props. Robert Lowe, Mats Laven, and then this Bjorn guy from this whole era. So let's get into From the 13th Sun, which directly followed Dactylis Glomerata pretty quickly too. Came out the next year.
Yeah, the next year, right?
Yeah, and they same basic lineup, although they kept everybody except Amat was out, and a then unknown guitarist named Mott Stahl came in. I've been a believer in this album since its release. I remember when it came out feeling like I was the only one in the world who had to care about it because Dactylis did not do well. Why would anybody care about this album, right? For me, it's in the top 3 of the best Candlemass albums, sometimes tied with number 1.
2 favorite Candlemass records are Epicus and From the 13th Sun.
Mine is Epicus, Nightfall, and From the 13th Sun tied for first. Can I be that ridiculous? But, you know, I mean, like, I was friends with Chris Maycock then and now, a.k.a. Chris Black. He came forth immediately as a lover of that, so that was good for me to have an anchor out there somewhere. This guy named John Gaffney, who started the Candlemass Chronicles, was co-creator of that amazing magazine. They even dedicated their very first issue to From the 13th Sun. And for people that don't know Candlemass Chronicles, this was a zine series in the mid-2000s. Every issue was a different Candlemass album focused on. And the layout was amazing. The writing was amazing. The intent and the overall sort of like information capture was all incredible. And apparently there are no back issues of those because I missed some of them. But they started their thing with From the 13th Sun. So he was a big believer. And then, of course, you, Hunter, when I met you, this was probably one of the first albums we bonded on. Was like, oh, you love From the 13th Sun Candlemass. That's awesome.
I really think it's one of the like great underrated metal albums of the late 90s.
And why? What about it? Because you know what? If you read it on paper, at least what Leif Endling says about it, it's nothing but a Black Sabbath tribute. But I don't.
And I remember actually getting into an argument with Jim Raggi about that, and that's what he said. He said, "Oh, it's just a Black Sabbath cover album." I think that's poppycock. I think that it's the work of a visionary who is very influenced by a particular band and then takes that influence into a completely different place. It's obvious. You hear like the Black Sabbath influence.
Sure.
Which is apparent in most doom. But like, I just hear Leif Endling through and through in this.
I also hear him using his guys in his band a little more too. I mean, they're there on Glomerata, but there's more Carl Westholm here. There's more Mott Stahl, the new guitarist. That guy is key on this album. His rack of effects, analog effects, is unbelievable. And I think this is Bjorn's better album. He's awesome on Glomerata, but his singing on From the 13th Sun, even better, even more. It's just richer, more emotional, takes you kind of to an even deeper place. And then Perkovic is just an awesome drummer.
No, he's for sure better on this album. I think the drumming on this record is really remarkable, actually.
What makes you say that?
It's incredibly musical and sensitive. I love the way the drums are recorded. It's a metal record, but I don't think the drums are metal drums. It's almost like the way that Chris Reifert approaches death metal, or maybe even like Nicky Anderson to a certain extent. It's like a rock drummer playing death metal. I almost feel like this is a jazz drummer playing doom metal.
We've mentioned both Anderson and Reifert before, and we will again. I mean, those are probably two of our favorite death metal drummers, if not the two greatest. I guess Sean Reinhardt has to go in there.
He's okay.
But to your point, man, you're completely right on about that. And I haven't really thought about it maybe from that angle. But let's jump ahead a little bit on this album before we play anything. There's a song called Cyclo F, and it's great as a song. And then what it does the impossible. Now, hear me out. I fucking hate in-studio drum solos. Like, they can never be good. I love drumming, man, but I want it within this context of the song. Live, I think Neil Peart and Mike Mangini are two of the few drummers I've ever seen where I wanted the drum solo to go on longer. So,
I say this as a drummer. I hate both in-studio and live drum solos. I hate drum solos altogether.
However, I think you're going to mirror my opinion on this, but let me just put it out there. And I think we've talked about this before, but let's go public. His drum solo on this is awesome because it's not really planned out. Apparently he was smoking as he was drumming, according to Candlemass Chronicles. He said it himself. But it's so loose and weird, and it fits into the cosmic nature of the album. It actually goes on a little too long, and when they crash in with the music, that drum solo has so much impact. What you just heard has more impact because of the space it offered to the album, and then the band coming in and crashing in with another doom riff. And suddenly you're like, oh, that was an amazing in-studio drum solo. I've never said that before. I don't think I've even said it again. I mean, Is that just me? Do I have a special affinity for it that maybe I'm just trying to convince myself?
No. I remember actually reading about it and sort of like knowing when it came into the album and wincing and walking away from it like so moved. It's almost poetic. It's like a really, really delicate, like calligraphic improv. And I don't like.
Yeah, it's free verse.
I have a really uneasy relationship with improvisation just altogether.
Yeah, me too.
But like, there's just something so dialed in about it.
Even though it's free verse, you talked about being poetic, like it's free verse poetry. It's like, it's just kind of flows one over here and it goes over. Like it doesn't really have a point, yet it never feels superfluous. Like it's always like that needs to kind of be there. Like I never want the album without it. Again, that's an important point to make. We're probably spending too much time on it, but I think both of us and a lot of people out there hate studio drum solos. So there you go. It's a good one. We like it. Now we can move on and talk about the stringed instruments and the vocalist. The album, we talked a little bit about how From the 13th Sun sounds. It was recorded completely in analog. Late 90s, maybe one of the last albums to really do that, unless you're like a Pearl Jam or something.
Yeah, like that and Mr. Bungles, California.
Which was what, 99, 2000?
It came out in 99. It was recorded. Yeah, it was I think it was recorded like late 98, early 99. But one of the last grand old analog productions.
Right. And we're going to listen to another grand analog production. This is probably my favorite song of this entire era of Candlemass, a song called Tod, which is T-O-T. It translates into death in German, and that's exactly what Leif Endling's purpose was. This was actually supposed to be the name of the album. I don't know if you knew that, Hunter, but
no.
Record label didn't like that, so he came up with the title that it now bears, From the 13th Sun, which he said it means absolutely nothing. But it's a cool title. But this song, what do you want to say about Tod?
I agree with you. I don't know that I'm going to say it's my favorite from this era, but it's one of them for sure.
Let's do it.
Yeah, I mean, like, we're basically walking through, like, all the different moods of this era of Candlemass in this one little clip that we played.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
But, man, like, the vocals on this are just unbelievably moving to me and just ghostly and evocative. And, yeah, so the guitar effects, too, right?
Yeah, Mach Stahl, man. I mean, his work on here is amazing, and Leif Endling and even Westholm kind of point to him as like a key of this album.
Well, it's almost like he kind of reroutes the virtuosity of like Mike Weed, Mike Amott, and like instead of shred, you get like this incredible faculty with effects. It's like effect shred.
Well, you know what's weird? I kind of 5 minutes before we met for this recording of this episode, I was thinking about Piggy from Voivod, which I often do, but I thought we're probably not going to have any reason to mention Voivod on this episode because it seems like they come up all the time. Imagine that. But now that you say that, I have to mention Piggy because he kind of went through a phase. He went through a phase where he didn't play solos anymore, but he did effects. I mean, you think about Phobos.
I was about to say his work on Phobos is incredible.
And I think it's an analog to what Mach Stahl did on this album, in a way.
Yeah, and I mean, same era. Basically,
late 90s, 99, sure.
Yeah.
And that was an era where like people were like consciously, we're not doing solos anymore. Kirk Hammett was talking down about solos at one point. Just ridiculous, but I think Piggy and Mach Stahl in these examples, they made that work really well. Like you didn't miss the solos.
No, not at all.
The next snippet we're going to play is this song called ARX NG 891. What we're going to hear is sort of the skeleton of the song, and we're very deep into it at this point, and that's important to remember because the snippet ends near the end of the song. It's this totally chill bed of effects, and I think this is a good time to play this since we're talking about all the effects. Goes on for another 2 minutes after what we hear, but it's that kind of bravery, and it's right in the middle of the album. That's that kind of bravery and experimentation that kind of marks this era of Candlemass. Just like, yeah, let's do 2.5 minutes of swirling effects and nothing else. Stuff they never would have thought about doing back in the so-called classic era, right?
I think it's pertinent to note. I remember a playlist of Leif Endling's from Maniacs, and I believe it was like in 99 when this album came out, and he was listening to OK Computer and he was listening to Tea Party's Triptych. So like his head was in another place too.
Yeah.
Like of course it's in Black Sabbath, but like he's obviously opening himself up to other influences and to other sounds. And it's like it sort of like gives him license to do something like this.
Yeah, really good point, and really on the mark in terms of the song we're going to listen to. So let's check this out.
What's up and soon it's gone. Soon it's gone.
So my question there is, who let Klaus Schultz run amok in Goblin's rehearsal room? You don't have an answer?
A wise man.
So before we get to the next snippet,
Anybody with taste.
yeah. Anything else you want to say about that?
No, let's proceed.
Yeah, I mean, before we get to the last snippet from this great from the 13th Sun album, like I mentioned earlier, they had some great B-sides. Some of that stuff can be heard on the Whiz EP. This 7-inch called Rock and Roll Remiss just splits sides between rock and roll and a song called Remiss. Highly recommend tracking down the Whiz EP, which has stuff like Thirst and Container and
Whiz EP is awesome.
Bug Queen. I mean, yeah, that stuff really predates Candlemass, goes back to the Abstrakt Algebra 2 album. Interestingly, this is kind of cool. This lineup that we're listening to on From the 13th Sun got together in 2007 to record a few more songs. So we're talking, 8 years later? Is my math right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, for bonus tracks on this vinyl reissue of From the 13th Sun, which was the first time it was ever out on vinyl. They did something called Odessa Chamber, a pretty forgettable instrumental, nothing exciting. A song called Socrates with a K, which goes back to Abstrakt Sun with a K, I suppose, and Abstrakt Algebra with a K. And then there was John the Leper, which is a really great track, but one of the interesting things about that song is it wasn't written by Endling. It was written by Bjorn, the singer. And as any Candlemass fan knows, Leif wrote pretty much everything, unless it was like a small little snippet or he had a little co-write here and there. But John the Leper, yeah, that's a standalone Bjorn Fludkivist song, and it's a really good one. Yeah, so this is another track from the 13th Sun. This is Galatia. Pretty much speaks for itself, like so much of the album, and I encourage listeners to get this on any format, any version. It'll be money well spent. This is Galatia from the 13th Sun.
That one track really takes me back. I got that record in February of 2000. Okay. So I didn't get it right when it came out. I got it from Metal Disc. Lila, is that her name?
Yep.
And Galatia really just right now kind of took me back to February of 2000. So
I think I know which albums you're listening to tomorrow, right?
Yeah. Anathema, Judgment, From the 13th Sun. What else?
That's a good pair. After this, the band dissolved. I mentioned Enter the Hunt earlier. That was a band that Bjorn and also the guitarist Mats were in. Not on the same levels from the 13th Sun. I checked it out recently, but sounds pretty decent. And it landed on Epic Records of all places. I don't know. I suppose it probably just a European deal or a Scandinavian deal.
Yeah, I would think probably, yeah. It's
Yeah.
Sweden.
Carl Westholm went on to this band called Carp Tree, this prog band, and they've had 7 albums, and they're kind of in the Marillion, Porcupine Tree kind of vein. And I would say that Porcupine Tree and Marillion are very different bands, but there's elements of both there. Yeah, and Leif, of course, went on to resurrect the Nightfall era of Candlemass 6 years after 13th Sun was put out. In the meantime, he formed a band called Crux with a couple guys from the post-classic era of Entombed and Frederick Åkesson from Talisman and Opeth. What's your experience with Crux? Like, is this something that was on your radar after liking these Candlemass albums? And
no, it completely missed me.
Have you listened to it?
No.
I have, and I feel like so many people like it, but the stuff that I've listened to, I just feel like it feels like leftover Candlemass. It's doom without much purpose. It's like, why didn't he do that with Candlemass? So I'm a little bit befuddled by Crux, and if people want to try to enlighten me, they can send compact discs of Crux to Walker Avenue, Greensboro, North Carolina, 37403. And I know they've come across my desk before and my hi-fi, but I've gotten rid of them. Yeah, and that's pretty much the story. So let me ask you this, Hunter. Of all the stuff you know from the later Candlemass, the self-titled with Messiah and the Nightfall lineup, the Robert Lowe stuff, the Mats Levin stuff, did anything from the Dactylis and 13th Sun era inform anything later for Candlemass?
I really kind of have to go back and listen to it with that in mind, but not really. To me, it kind of sounded like after 13th Sun, Leif abandoned that and then just kind of went back to making his own trademark brand of doom metal.
And I agree with that. I ask as kind of somewhat of a devil's advocate in a way. I mean, I agree. There was something on the self-titled, what was it called? Copernicus. That was kind of
yeah.
Kind of that spacey, cosmic, sci-fi, novel kind of vibe that some of these albums had, from the late 90s. There was some stuff on the Psalms for the Dead album, the last one with Robert Lowe, that I thought kind of touched on some of this. But for the most part, I'm going to agree with you. I think he swerved back to Candlemass and went to safer territory. After this, you got to have a career, right? Because you're not going to have a career
he's right
with songs like ARX and G891.
Probably not.
If only. Yeah.
We lived in a world where you could have a career with that.
Right. But you know what? I mean, this era of Candlemass has legendary pieces of perfection like Tote and Dustflow. That's in their back pocket forever. So hats off to Leif Endling and the 90s Candlemass.
Indeed.
Hey, Hunter, next episode, can you muster anything to say about 1993, particularly a certain day in September?
Maybe. For starters, and I believe you've actually mentioned this on the show before, you actually made me a shirt one time that said nothing but 1993 on it.
Indeed, I did.
Because that's pretty much the basis of my life, is 1993. Like, when I get down in the dumps, I just think back to 1993, and it gives me a reason to keep going. So for Radical Research 15, I know that this show was born out of an impulse to talk about Norwegian post-black metal. all the interesting things around that. But really, I think that radical research deep down was born out of an impulse to talk about the amazing and wonderful things that were happening in weirdo left field progressive metal in 1993. On a very fateful day, September 15th, 1993, sort of Roadrunner's last grasp at cutting edge metal. They released on one day Cynics, Focus, Believers, Dimensions, and Pestilent Spheres. And it's maybe the most important day in progressive death metal history. The mind.